6 days of protests across the country of Iran, more than 20 dead as a result of clashes with the police there. When the protests started last Thursday, reports indicated the demonstrators were motivated by economic reasons, high inflation, high unemployment. But they appear to have spread to multiple cities and now include protests against the supreme leader of the country, the Ayatollah Khamenei. And protesters called for a nationwide strike today. Just the last half hour, the White House called on Iran to unblock social media outlets like Instagram and Telegram. For more on the unrest in Iran and the impact of these protests in the Middle East, the rest of the world, let's bring in Michael Rubin. He's a scholar with the American Enterprise Institute. He has a Ph.D. in Iranian history, studied there, was also there for the 1999 protests. Good to have you here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Just so the audience knows, there have been protests in Iran, widespread, 1999, 2000, 2009, and now today. Give us some context here. How severe do you think these are that we are witnessing, and to what degree do they threaten to topple the regime of Iran?
Well, these protests are unlike what happened in 1999, 2001, and 2009. The reason is because people are no longer abiding by this notion that the reformists in Iran have a different agenda than the hardliners. They're going after the regime as a whole, and that's what's starting to scare the security forces. The second issue is that in the past, the security forces remained loyal. But we've gotten sporadic reports that certain members of the security forces are actually joining the protesters. The last example where I can think of something like this happening was in 1989 in Romania, and that ultimately led to the downfall of the Ceausescu regime.
So could this ultimately lead to regime change in Iran to a much greater degree than what we saw from those other protests?
Well, that seems to be the fear that the Iranian regime has. They've announced that anyone who has continued to participate in these protests after the third day will face a much more serious penalty, including perhaps the death penalty. We know from the aftermath of 1999 that the Chinese came in, got the Iranians up to speed on facial recognition software. I wouldn't be surprised if the police state is starting to take photos of the rallies, and then in 3 or 4 weeks, as things calm down, if they calm down, people will start to be arrested. So really, we're going to the point of no return because people fear that if they don't succeed in getting Khamenei to step down, which is a tall order, that they may end up in the infamous Evin prison.
How about the Revolutionary Guards? Have they really entered into these protests in any way? You mentioned security forces, but you did not mention the Revolutionary Guards, which are really Khamenei's folks, right?
Well, you're absolutely right. Look, the Iran has two militaries. It has the regular army, which is in charge of external defense, and it has the Revolutionary Guard, which is in charge of defense of the revolution, meaning the threats can come from inside or outside. There's been some talk of people from the paramilitary Basij, which a paramilitary force which answers to the Revolutionary Guard, joining in the protests. But here's what we don't know. You know, we always talk about hardliners versus reformers in Iran, but we talk about that in terms of the politicians. After 38 years of the Islamic Republic, we have no idea what the factional divisions are within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Now, in 2007, Iran reorganized the Revolutionary Guard. They put one unit in every province. And what we don't know, for example, is whether the people in those Revolutionary Guard units in each province are native to the provinces in which they serve. If they are, that suggests that ideology trumps kinship if given the order to fire in crowds in the street. But if they're already moving these Revolutionary Guardsmen around, that's an indication that at the very top of the regime, they're nervous that this could be their last year.
Michael, at what point do we start getting concerned that oil exports will be affected?
Well, we should be concerned for two reasons. Number one, if there is a strike in the oil fields, that's something that has never really happened before, but it's quite possible. Since 2005, we've had a number of wildcat strikes in Iran in different industries. And if the Iranian regime collapses, remember, the Revolutionary Guard controls 40% of the economy. The regime may go, but what will the Revolutionary Guard do afterwards? They may not just sail calmly into the night. They may have other plans. And we've seen where the Arab Spring went. There's no reason why Iran should have a peaceful transition if even Egypt, let alone Syria and Yemen, couldn't.
So I guess my question is, why did this happen now? And what is the mechanism by which these uprisings metastasize across the country when you've got, government control of media and so forth? Why now, and how? What is the transmission mechanism that makes them appear as coordinated as maybe they are or maybe they aren't?
Well, when we look at all the histories of the demonstrations, they've all started for different reasons. What we can tell collectively is that Iran is a tinderbox. The question is whether the government is better at smothering the embers than ordinary people are at fanning the flames. Iran is also a tremendously cosmopolitan society, and it's a connected society, which is why the Iranian government is trying to shut social media right now. But with VPNs and perhaps other technology, satellites and so forth, people may be trying to get around this. So we'll see what will happen. And there's a long history of mass movements in Iran. And one of the other things that upsets the regime is where the Arab autocrats could say, hey, this democracy thing, that's just a Western implant. Iran had a constitutional revolution in 1906. They can look at democratization, a parliamentary democracy, as an indigenous concept, not something imposed from outside. And that's also something that shakes and worries the Ayatollahs.
Michael, the response from the White House this time around under President Trump is so different from the response back in 2009 when President Obama was in power. What do you make of Donald Trump's attitude, what he's posted on Twitter? Is this how the U.S. should be handling this situation? And what should a CNBC business audience be watching for as the events unfold?
Well, first of all, there's nothing wrong with standing up for principles. If those principles are freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, we shouldn't necessarily be picking favorites. Most of the opposition groups we hear about in Iran are 40 guys in a newspaper, or they're externally based. They don't really have a great deal of legitimacy. What we should be looking at is whether or not these Revolutionary Guard units start turning on the regime itself. We know that the Revolutionary Guard isn't a homogenous unit, but we haven't really mapped the breakdown. That's going to be the key question. The other issue, which really makes this different from 2001 and 2009, is just the sheer number of casualties. And once we start having funerals, we could get into a 40-day cycle of mourning and protest, which is ultimately what brought the regime down in 1979.
Hey there, thanks for checking out CNBC on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of the day's biggest stories. You can also click on any of the videos around me to watch the latest from CNBC. Thanks for watching.